I'm convinced this morning that this is one of the most important passages in the whole Bible. For some of you, it will be absolutely sweet to ponder God in this way. For some of you, it may come across bitter and hard to swallow. For others, I recognize there will be questions. I like to tell people I eat 3 times a day. If you do the same, let's do it together. I'm happy to talk about any questions that come as you think about this text. And if you don't like food, but you like coffee, I'll do that as well. But I plead with you today to hear this message before the day of suffering comes upon you. This is not a passage to swallow in the midst of darkness. This is a passage you need in your heart before it comes. I was asked by an atheist this week, how can you believe in a loving God who would create man and woman who could so easily fall into sin that would bring about all the suffering and atrocities that we see in the world today? I wonder how you might respond. And I've actually yet to complete a response to this person, but as I've thought about how to respond, the typical replies that cycled through my mind were things like, well, God gave man free will. It isn't love if there isn't a choice. Well, the devil tempted them. God could use man's wicked choices to bring about a better good. Genesis 50, verse 20. But as I've thought about how to respond, and I've studied this passage all week to this unbeliever, this passage has continued to shape in my thoughts. And I think what this passage would say is, what if the answer isn't to reply to someone with a logical formula that might best justify God's choices for making a world where evil exists? What if the answer isn't to try to apologize for God and bring his logic down to their present view of things? What if instead the answer was to hold up a mirror to the person asking the question and saying something instead like this? Friend, I think your question is real and okay to ask, but let me see if I understand what you're asking. Friend, do you know the day of your death? Do you know what day that would be? My anticipation is any of us would say no. Maybe I'd ask another question. Can you tell me whether or not 100 years from now, the United States would still be a United Nations? Can you know that? Do you know that? No, you don't know that. Can you tell me what the results of the presidential election will be next year? Do you know that? No, I don't know that either. Given how little you and I know, perhaps it's wise to consider you and I aren't prepared to evaluate the ethics of a God who made the world as he has chosen to do so. As Nate hinted at earlier in Job chapter 38, verse 4, after all of Job's friends had been counseling him, trying to find some reason for why Job was suffering, God ultimately says to Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" There is a time that it is right where you and I, instead of thinking we're in a position to debate the ethics of God's purposes, what the human soul needs is to listen. And for that reason, the preacher today is going to tell us you and I benefit far more by attending funerals than we do birthday parties. I'm going to zoom out and summarize where we are. If I could summarize the crisis that the preacher of Ecclesiastes has been getting at throughout his book, it's this. Outside and apart from God, through an empirical worldview, man thinks he can change the world because he refuses to accept that he knows very little. And because man does not know, he estimates himself capable of navigating the terrain before him. And the preacher is saying, you need to look at the facts. mankind, human beings, are like a husband driving through South Carolina to get to Hilton Head Island. The trip starts well because we have a GPS on our phone. But then you hit those hour-long stretches where service disconnects completely and there's no phone signal. Your wife lovingly says, "Why don't you just ask for directions?" And you say, "We don't need to. I know where I'm going." This isn't a true story. And it's inevitable that the man learns he does not know and he cannot lead his family where he intends to go. That's what the preacher is saying all throughout Ecclesiastes. You can't navigate the terrain outside of Eden in a fallen and cursed world. Now let me remind you, we are now at the seam in the book of Ecclesiastes. So for 6 chapters, he's been arguing something, and today, at the end of chapter 6, the beginning of chapter 7, we hit the seam of the book. And you'll notice the nature of the passage changes in chapter 7 with all those blessing statements, all those good or better statements. And what he's doing is he's changing his perspective a little to address now what he has proven. But let me remind you where we've been so far. The book opened in chapter 1 with a poem recognizing that you and I are stuck in a cycle. And we're fools if we think we can break free. Remember, he said, watch the sun. Has the sun broken free? Have the winds broken free? Have you found enough desires satisfied that you don't desire anything else? Have your eyes seen enough? Have your ears heard enough praise? Nobody's made any progress. Life in our hands brings no lasting advantage. Later generations produce nothing that earlier generations didn't already produce. We're not making progress. And at the end of chapter 1, he laments that what is crooked cannot be made straight. Remember that phrase. What's crooked cannot be made straight. Remember that phrase. What's cannot be. Remember that. We can't do that. It's going to come up in our passage. Chapter 2, the preacher taught us that as the richest man in the Middle East, as the king who had access to other cultures, as one who could do whatever he wanted, could gain every pleasure, his attempt to rebuild Eden failed as a way of saying, I've tried, don't go after that. You can't do it, mankind. So the next thing he did is he made us stare death in the face, and he taught us that death is the great leveler. Whether you choose the wise life or the foolish life, everyone's buried over there in Bellevue Cemetery with diverse IQs, and yet they all lay 6 feet under. Chapter 3 told us that time is the great preacher, and it wasn't celebrating all the diverse opportunities we had under the sun. It was saying, look, every single society that's ever lived is stuck in these rhythms. None of us have escaped it. We're bound by the times God has chosen to allot. In chapter 4, he reminded us that there is no lasting deliverance from the oppression of human governance. We can try for a season. We can give thanks for societies that are more livable. But in the end, oppression always comes back because man's hands can't deliver themselves from the corruption that exists under the sun. In fact, we saw that ultimately human culture outside of Eden is bent towards an anti-culture in 3 ways. Number 1, we consume one another. Number 2, we prefer to isolate ourselves from one another. And thirdly, we tend to reject wisdom. Chapter 5 reminded us that this takes place even among the religious. This isn't unique to secular societies. Religious people, as chapter 5 said, are prone not to believe in God. They have a functional atheism that marches into worship with hasty words and insincere speech. They praise God with their tongues, and then they curse one another in the other, all before God's temple he showed us. And last week we looked and we saw that at the end of the day, our riches can't make a difference. Rich people are often more miserable than the poor, and so getting a bunch of money under the sun isn't going to change it. So for 6 chapters, we've explored that outside of Eden, life is crooked and man cannot advance out of it. We can't take what is made crooked and straighten it out. I want you to see down at chapter 7 now, if you'll look with me, the logic of the passage. See it in verses 13 to 14. Consider the work of God. And see what he added there? He added the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked. Chapter 1, verse 15 is the introduction. You can't make straight what is crooked. Now in chapter 7, verse 13, consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful, and in the day of adversity consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. The preacher, as I reminded you, is doing all this by what he observes. He's taking what he can see under the sun, and he's drawing the conclusion that man cannot buck against the things God has made. Look around. Look at time. Look at death. Look at the dollar. Everything's the same since we fell from Eden. And so he's saying now in our chapter, you and I need to come to grips with these facts. Two facts, I think, drive this chapter. Number one, these realities demonstrate you cannot change what God has made. And number two, we need to learn to trust God because we cannot find out what's going to happen next. None of us can. We can't change what God has made, and therefore we need to trust him because we don't know what's going to happen next. Consider life under the sun. No one knows what's coming next, which means man is a bad hope for salvation. We planned last week for a hurricane to come, and by Wednesday evening, I know many of you who normally come did not come, and that's okay. But at the end of the day, how bad was that hurricane? Wasn't a big deal, was it? I'm glad we knew it might come. I'm glad we were able to think and take precautions, but our wisdom at the end of the day was quite inconsequential. And that's okay. Mankind simply doesn't know. We're guessing most of the time. And so what the preacher is telling you and I today is that instead of thinking that we know things, we need to develop a heart that listens. And one of the best ways to develop a heart that listens is to go to funerals, as you'll see in a moment. We need the voice of funerals in our lives because what is good outside of Eden is to be reminded that you and I are utterly weak. But there is one who knows the end from the beginning. It's only bad news to find out that you're weak if you don't realize there is one who knows the end from the beginning, whom you can fear. It is good news when you are lost in South Carolina and your GPS does not work that there are police officers who can show you where to go. When you realize how limited your insight is, when you realize you're bringing your family with you and they're following someone who doesn't know what's coming, how sweet it is to realize there are officers who will say, this is the way. In the same way, the preacher has deconstructed any confidence we had in ourselves in rebuilding Eden and saying, it's bad news if you are looking to man, but there is one you can look to. So the question I ask as we go over this passage is, will we learn from these first chapters 6 chapters that we've reflected on so far? Will we take this upside down counsel from the preacher that funerals are better for us than birthday parties? Are you prepared, now that you see this upside down world, to hear upside down wisdom? Let's look at verses 10 to 12 of chapter 6. Whatever has come to be has already been named, and it's known what man is, and that he's not able to dispute with one stronger than he. The more words, the more vanity. And what is the advantage of man? For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? The preacher continues to show us that the quest for joy actually begins with our despair. You see it there in verse 12? Those are despairing rhetorical questions. Human beings can't know by themselves what's good for them. And part of the reason we can't know what's good for us to do is the last question. We don't know what's coming next. If we knew, we'd have made different choices. Who can tell what's coming after these days. And I want you to notice that this is going to be the driving theme of the rest of the book. If you look at your sermon handout, in the middle of the page, there's a bunch of tiny font, and I know that's hard to read, but those small texts there are the verses throughout the rest of the book. They're going to repeat this theme over and over. You can't find out anything that will be after you. Man does not know what is to be. Man cannot find out the work that is done. Man does not know. Man does not know. No man knows what is to be. You know not what disaster may happen. You do not know the work of God. You don't know which will prosper. And so what he's done for six chapters is he's built the case that if you and I really are honest secularists, if we really are going by the evidence, the conclusion you and I must come to is we don't know much. Maybe by way of example, let me ask you this. Will Georgia three-peat this year? I'm sure you could have a good debate over lunch about that. Will Georgia three-peat? Will Trump be the next president? Will the Braves win the series? Will someone in this room be diagnosed with cancer in the next 6 months? It should immediately unsettle us that no one in this room knows the answer to those questions. We can make our best guesses, but let's be honest. What a group of fools we are. Our knowledge ends now. I can't tell you 30 minutes from now who's going to send me an email about this sermon. There's so much we don't know. But verse 10 says, there is something we know. He says we know what man is. And by that he means we've already figured out the estimation of man. He's stuck in a cyclical history. He can't escape time. Death limits any progress he thought he had. Everything he's explored so far taught us we know what man is, and what man is he does not know what's next. And therefore, do you see the logic in verse 10? He's in no place to contend with God. The stronger than he is God. Man is in no place to contend with God. Verse 10, what's happened was planned. That's what the point of that passage is there. Whatever has come to be has already been named, and it's known what man is. That is, what God has planned is what has happened, and we know that man cannot contend with that. There is no scenario in which it is wise to think the ignorance of man can challenge what God is doing in the world. It is illogical by its very nature. And what God has chosen to do, what the preacher is reflecting on, is stated most explicitly by the Apostle Paul in Romans 8, verse 20. And the Apostle Paul in Romans 8, verse 20 is looking back at creation after the fall, and he's explaining where all this is coming from, all the futility that we see, all the frustrations, the cancers, the deaths, the evils, the corruptions. And he said, God in his freedom chose to subject an unwilling creation to that we might find out who the sons and daughters of God are. God did that in the hope that you and I would look up from this creation and look to him. And so what the preacher is saying from the other perspective is saying, therefore it makes no sense to try to puff ourselves up as one who can challenge God's decision to do that. I understand verses like this suffocate us sometimes. And the temptation in our minds right now is we want to qualify. We want to say, well, yes, God has chosen to do this, but man this or man that or the devil this or the devil that. The preacher doesn't go there. He wants you to sit under this reality. You don't know, therefore you can't contend, and it's good for you to feel the weight of that. There's something liberating in that. It's not a restriction to be confronted by what I don't know. It's freeing to hit the end of my power so that I might look up to one who is strong. Because you see what happens if we try to qualify it in verse 11? The more words, the more hebel. The more advantageless talk. We don't need to run our mouths in light of this truth. We need to be confronted by it. Because there are realities you can't escape. And you can learn from those realities if you understand God is doing something in them. But if you run your mouth, if you try to get people from under this pressure, you take them away from the grace that they could face if they would learn that God is doing something. The prideful heart wants to run its mouth against verse 10 to make it more palatable. But the preacher says what we need in those moments is to be faced with the fact that God is doing something with these days. And so the right thing is to shut our mouths and listen. Why? Verse 12 again. Because we don't know what's good. Because we don't know what's coming next. To say it this way, the preacher is reflecting on the fact that post-Genesis chapter 3, our dominion is no longer effective. Our dominion has failed, and we need someone's dominion who will work. But as long as we still think our dominion works, our ruling can fix things, we will refuse to look to the one whose ruling works. So what he's saying here is that having reflected on time, having reflected on death, having reflected on how ineffective riches are, things are upside down. We aren't capable of having dominion as God had originally created us. You were made to have dominion, but you and I can no longer find success in exercising it. Therefore, there will be no relief for you and me if we pretend that we are in any place to address God, to dialogue with him, to question his ethics. Now, Alvin Plantinga is a Christian philosopher, very notable over the last half century, and he dealt with the problem of evil similar to this way. He notes that the problem of evil, this idea that given X amount of corruption in the world, it's unlikely that a loving God exists, and he makes the point that that's actually a probability argument. And he goes on to show that the problem with this argument is that it only works if you assume man has total knowledge of everything. It only works if we think we actually have all the answers. I'll try to give you an example is the problem with it. Jeff lives in Georgia, and 9 out of 10 Georgians cannot drink unsweetened tea. And the odds are that Jeff does not like unsweetened tea, right? That seems, given what we know, it is probable that if Jeff is in Georgia and 9 out of 10 Georgians don't drink unsweet tea, it is very likely Jeff does not like unsweet tea. But couldn't the probability of this whole argument radically change if we had a little bit more data? It turns out that while Jeff currently lives in Georgia, he was born in Massachusetts. Suddenly the conclusion is far more likely that Jeff likes unsweet tea, despite 9 out of 10 Georgians liking unsweet tea. That's all it takes. It's all it takes is a little more data to radically shift our understanding of things. So who are we to think we can approach God and ask him based on what we currently understand about everything? We don't know. We weren't there when he created everything, and we don't even know what's coming tomorrow. The sum of our questioning comes from our naive presumption that we think we have a totality of data when we have no idea where all of this is going. Why the swing of probability so quickly? Because you and I don't know the details. How silly it is to presume that you and I can evaluate God's choices while we know so little. We don't even know what's coming next. And since we live in an upside-down world, and what hinders us here is that we refuse to accept that we do not understand everything, what we really need to do is listen to an upside-down wisdom. That's where he's going now. Chapter 7, verses 1 to 17. We are in an upside-down world, and now he gives us upside-down wisdom outside of Eden. Verses 1 to 17. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of the fools is in the house of mirth. It's better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity. Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he's made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful. In the day of adversity consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. Now let me say, the reason he gives this wisdom is because he does not understand God's purposes to remove human culpability. Your choices matter. You make real choices and meaningful choices. So he confronts us with the radical sovereignty of God. And he says, because this is what God is doing, here's how we ought to walk. Verse 1, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. What he's saying there, precious ointment, is precious in the ancient world where smelling good was so rare. And he's telling us it is better to care about good character than to worry about whether or not you smell like a corpse. At the end of the day, because all of us will stand before God, what really matters is not what's on the outside. It's okay to smell like a corpse if you walk through life. But what's not okay is to neglect the health of the inward heart. Because we know God is working all of this, that as you see in your sermon handout on the thesis of Ecclesiastes, which is not on there this time. That's probably my fault because I put too much in there. But Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 to 14 tells you that every deed will come before God under judgment. And because of that, we know God's not going to hold you accountable to how you smell. Because we know God reigns and he sees all, it is wisdom to give ourselves to thinking about our hearts and our character. Verse 2 tells us it's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind. Isn't it the case that we prefer parties, birthday parties, over funerals? And there's nothing wrong with birthday parties. But he notes that the reality is the end of our lives is defined not by the birthdays, but by the funerals. In other words, the wise person, because of the fall, gives their heart to ponder the curse. He's not drunk on the idea that he can escape it. Instead, he lets his heart dwell in the funeral home and realizes, I need to think and I need to learn by the reality of death. But the fool gives himself to forgetting. He wants sedation from death, not medication. He wants movies and sports and work and ceremony. He wants to persuade himself not to look at it. But the wise and the righteous understands that in a fallen world, the deaths of others are rare opportunities to be sobered up and to cultivate wisdom. It brings us a calculation we would otherwise refuse to look at. Death is more definitive than birth, so the wise ponders the day of death. Verse 3, sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the heart is made glad. There's nothing wrong with laughter. It's good to joke. But the wise remembers that we're no longer in paradise, so if levity is the rhythm of one's life, it produces a cancer of the soul. There is a laughter worse than drunkenness. It's the sort of laughter that one pursues to replace one's being confronted by death and having a sobered joy. The wise know that sadness is a real ally. Biblical Christianity does not look away from death. It stares it in the face and tries to learn the lesson. As C.S. Lewis says, there's a kind of happiness that makes you serious, and it's too good to waste on jokes. The believer understands that in a world marred by sin, there are deeper joys that can only be found in walking through sorrow by looking to God. I'm not saying go look for it, but the wise believer knows that it cannot be escaped, and it is better to prepare for the day of death than to forget it through the levity of mirth. Have we joined the sedation techniques of the culture around us? Have we conceived of a God who exists to simply keep us from grief? Or do we remember that God reigns over both the day of prosperity and the day of adversity, which means there is joy and wisdom for you in the darkest of trials? Verse 4, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. He repeats what he said. The foolish heart, by nature, is determined to live in levity. Distraction by entertainment, distraction by alcohol, distraction by productivity, even ceremony. He only wants to set his heart on the themes that are happy. But the wise has his eyes set on the reality of death. When I had to have my first surgery, I was probably, in my late 20s, and I hate surgeries. And so I went in, they had me on the table, and they were trying to put the IV in, and my heart rate dropped. It was just pound, 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 and the nurse is going, hey, so what kind of music do you like? And all I could say was, that's not helping. I couldn't take my eyes off of the fact they were pricking me with a needle. It's saying that's what the wise does in the reality of death. They don't let themselves get drawn away by distraction. They give their heart to the counsel of death is coming for all of you, so that they live in choices of wisdom. They make the best use of the time because the days are evil. They refuse to give themselves to a sort of light Christianity that can't stare death in the face. Verse 5. It's better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. The fool develops an echo chamber in life. They go only to the places that sing the songs that they love to hear. He wants the same old tunes, the same old ways. He doesn't want to give himself to the work of being corrected because correction means change, and he only wants things his way. He is preoccupied with the busyness of his hobbies and his work because they protect him from being changed by truth. There's a great book, All God's People and Blue Suede Shoes, reflecting on how we think about high art and folk art and pop art. And in there's a great quote about the nature of what pop culture does. We normally think of pop culture as a distraction from things, but it's actually not a distraction. He says it's really a mirror for continuing to reinforce everything that we love. He says both producer and consumer of pop culture confine themselves to what fits into their own schemes. The world of popular art is bound by the limited horizons of what we think we know already. It's two-dimensional because we're determined to view it without budging a step from where we already stand. We're addicted to sitcoms, to rhythms of work, sports, civil religion, because it keeps us in the songs that refuse to make us change. But the text says that the wise gives his heart to hear a rebuke. Proverbs 18 verse 2 says, the fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. But those who realize we're out of Eden hear our need for correction. Boys, I told you I'd ask you this. Rebuke a wise man and he will love you. Proverbs 9 verse 8. Those whose hearts are guided by wisdom want to be changed. Verse 6. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. This also is vanity. There's a parable in the lighting of thorns on fire. How do we think about the frivolities of the fool? Well, you think about the way thorns burn. When you light them on fire, they make all sorts of excessive motion. It looks like life, but it's prophetic. It's prophetically ironic because all that crackling, all that things that sound like noise in life is actually the prophecy of their own imminent destruction. And so this proverb says, those who refuse to hear the lesson of death are like the thorns, living in all sorts of lightness and forgetfulness. And what looks like the path of joy and all of that noise is really a mirage that is prophesying their own destruction because they refuse to gaze at the reality of death and what God is doing through it. Verse 7. Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Preachers getting to the reality that even the wisest of people can fall, can't they? We know Solomon, the wisest king to ever live, fell. And so we must not make the mistake of thinking that wisdom will become our Savior. There'll be more on that at the very end, but for the moment we have to remember that even oppression can drive the wise into folly. We must avoid the extreme of thinking that we will be saved simply because of what we know in wisdom. Verse 8, better is the end of the thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. In light of what we know, that is that we don't know the end, it is wise to suspend judgment, is what he's saying. The fool is eager to jump to conclusions in the midst of a matter. While he only has half the picture, he has already determined the nature of what he is addressing. He cannot see everything, but he reasons that God cannot exist or that God cannot be good from only half the picture. He delights in his premature conclusions, whereas the wise sees the folly of such hasty decisions. The wise is patient, trusting, waiting. The wise realizes he or she knows very little and waits to the end. Verse 9, be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. There's a way that appears wise in this culture. He who is angry the loudest seems to get his way. There are those who believe that by their anger they can affect and control the situation. They think that to have their will is to let anger draw near in their hearts, and they reason from bitterness, they reason from frustration, and they think it is most freeing to lash out. But the fool gives full vent to his anger. He cannot look clearly. He can only see what he wants in the moment. Verse 10, say not, why were the former days better than these? It's not from wisdom that you ask this. There's a folly that soothes itself like alcohol through nostalgia. I'll just medicate my fears and my concerns of the present by dreaming about the past. But the reality is, we should know our souls lie to us about the past. People still divorced 50 years ago. They just did it quietly. People still murdered 50 years ago. People still abused one another. People still practiced homosexuality. The religious still concealed their hypocrisy. Wisdom is not so fooled by the present evils of things. It realizes that the former days were just as evil, and it recognizes that the present days there's just as much an occasion to hope because Jesus still reigns. Verses 11 to 12. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. How do we navigate this upside-down world, he says? Well, imagine the way a financial advisor would say, well, you need these three levels of financial protection. You need a defensive investment, you need an offensive investment, and you need, risky spending. I don't remember what they call it, but use your money to protect yourself. Well, the preacher says, no, use wisdom. Reflect. Give yourself to deep thought. We're not all thinking on the same level, and that's okay, but give yourself to stare reality in the face. Face the facts. You will find that wisdom is good for you, he says. And here's why, verses 13 to 14, because you need to learn. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he's made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful. In the day of adversity consider. God has made one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. Brothers and sisters, This is a sweet comfort to us, unless we're still drunk on the thought that we know it's coming next. You need to consider. God uses days of prosperity just as he uses days of affliction. And you see the purpose clause at the end of verse 14? He uses both so that you don't rely on yourself. You can't navigate what's coming next. And that's okay, because he can. You need to look to him. There were two preachers in the city of London in the 1800s. One was atheist poet Charles Swinburne, and he wrote this poem at the end. It says, "And the love song of earth, as God dies, resounds through the wind of her wings. Glory to man in the highest, for man is the master of things." How foolish. Man can't even tell you what's happening tomorrow. Man can't tell you the day of his death. Man can't escape the rhythms of time. And yet, apart from God's grace, that's what our heart wants to sing, doesn't it? My heart bends towards that. I'm the master of things. But for so many in this room, God in his grace of Ephesians 2 has worked in your heart to make you alive in Christ so that we don't agree with that preacher in London. In fact, we agree with a different one. Charles Spurgeon, who said, "There is no doctrine more hated by worldlings, no truth of which they have made such a football as the great, stupendous, but yet most certain doctrine of the sovereignty of the infinite Jehovah. Men will allow God to be everywhere except on his throne. They'll allow him to be in the workshop to fashion worlds and to make stars. They'll allow him to be in his alimony to dispense his alms and bestow his bounties. They'll allow him to sustain the earth and bear up the pillars thereof, or light the lamps of heavens, or rule the waves of the ever-moving ocean. But when God ascends his throne, his creatures then gnash their teeth. And when we, his preachers, proclaim an enthroned God and his right to do as he wills with his own, to dispose of his creatures as he thinks well, without consulting them in the matter, then it is that we are hissed at and ever rated. Then it is that men turn a deaf ear to us. For God on his throne is not a God they love. They love him anywhere better than they do when he sits with his scepter in his hand and his crown upon his head. But it was Spurgeon who would go on to say, "How much I've learned to kiss the waves that throw me against the rock of ages." That's what verse 14 is saying. The waves of prosperity, the waves of adversity are like waves in the ocean beating on you over and again, back to the shore, to the rock of ages where true footing really lies. You can't swim in the ocean of time. But if you learn its lesson, you'll find resting on the shore of Christ is a sweet place to be. So we've looked at the upside-down world. We've looked at, real briefly, this upside-down wisdom, and he's going to bring it to a close with the upside-down way forward, verses 15 to 18. "In my vain life I've seen everything. There's a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs his life with his evil doing. Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It's good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand, for the one who fears God shall come out from the both of them." I think what these 4 verses are doing is they are saying there are 2 ways to live that place the emphasis on what you and I do, and there's an alternative way to live that looks to the weight of God's acting and working. The first is this. He notes that, in fact, the reality is, if you pay attention, righteous people die young. Believers die early. There's a reason the death of Pastor Chuck shakes us. How could a man who loved God be taken so young? Ponder that. Don't breeze past it. It happens. And strangely, wicked people live a long time. Like so many people in government who are often, it seems, lying, seem to be living into their 80s. Maybe that's the way to go. But the preacher says, don't get confused and think that it's by your deeds you are being measured. Don't fall into a karma-like existence. There's two ways we could do that. Number one, verse 16, we could be overly righteous. We could be scrutinizing ourselves that I will get more days if I hit these standards, like Martin Luther before he was converted, thinking that the bolt of lightning was a karma-like response from God for his ways. But the preacher says, don't think that what's happening to you is because of the righteous choices you've made. But you could fall into the alternative. Well, if it doesn't matter, then I'll just live however I want. And so he says, well, why would you go and live that way? There are actually real-life consequences if you live wickedly. You drink yourself to death, die early. You get drunk and you die behind the wheel. There are real-life consequences to dying early because of your foolishness. He says, stop making decisions based on whether or not it's your righteousness or your wickedness that's the most important. Instead, verse 18, he says, you want to make it through a life where you have the potential of righteousness and evil? The way through is not through the weightiness of your deeds, but the weightiness of the deeds of another. You see it there in verse 18? The one who fears God shall come out of them both. I hope you hear what he's saying. This is liberating. It is liberating to see that my hope is not bound to my deeds. God hasn't left you to climb your way out of a corrupt world. Instead, God is saying, through the waves of time, through the waves of prosperity and adversity, he's saying, look up and listen. There's one you can fear who gathers his people, who saves his people. It's his deeds in history that are the ultimate determiner of things. So life is best lived looking at that. Which begs the question, what is God doing in this world? What is God doing with death? And what is he doing with prosperity? What is God doing with affliction? And what is God doing with affluence? Well, church, we know that that answer is bound up in the person of Jesus Christ. Let's listen to the words of Jesus in John 5. Jesus describes history this way. He says, my Father is working until now, and I am working. The Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. And greater works than these he will show him. So also the Son gives life to whom he will. For as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. For the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son, just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent me. Truly I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life. You see what Jesus is saying there? Eternal life is not the sum of the choices you and I make. It's not accomplished by being overly scrutinizing of your behavior such that you don't even know if you can eat this or that or if you should do this or that. There's no liberty there. You'll be destroyed by your own righteousness. But there's no liberty in wickedness either. You die young often through the consequences of your actions, and if you live long, well, that's all you get. Those are the only days you get. But Jesus is saying God has placed his works far more consequentially upon Jesus' work. And the work of Jesus is to raise from the dead to life those who trust in him. There's hope for you, church, out of Eden, and you know that. You can get to the New Jerusalem outside of this cursed world, not by a heavy focus on the summation of your works, but by trusting the wisdom of God to carry you in prosperity and to uphold you through adversity. And so don't be afraid of the funerals. Don't be afraid of sorrow. As the preacher told us, I think it's in verse 4, it's in verse 3, by sadness of face, the heart is made glad. Didn't Christ demonstrate this? His joy was full, and yet he wept before the death of Lazarus. He wept in the Garden of Eden, considering the consequences of the sin of man that he would bear. he wept and yet had fullness of joy, with his heart fixed upon the cross, from which we saw death did not end things for him. He was raised to life by the power of God. He's our example. We can stare death in the face because Christ has overcome it for the sins of his people, for all who would trust in him. The wise response to a fallen world is not a karma-like religion that is obsessed with our choices. It is a contemplation of the great work that God has planned in Christ. Therefore, we do not run from death, we contemplate it, because we know the one who rose from death for sinners, and we trust him to use it all to bring us from death to life. I'll close just with this real briefly. It is so sweet to meet with those of you who know this. I was confronted yesterday by the Bells. As I met with them, Doug's body displaying the clear effects of cancer eating away at him. I was struck in the moment by how large their eyes were, filled with tears, and yet they were so filled with joy as we read the scriptures together. We read Psalm 112. The righteous man does not fear bad news. His heart is firm, trusting the Lord. We read Psalm 77, where we realized that the way Israel made it out of Egypt was not through a prairie, it was through the ocean where people die. God chose to use the Red Sea to bring his people into the promised land. We contemplated Psalm 23, the sweetness of Jesus as a shepherd. Whether in the valley of the shadow of death or before our enemies, we graze upon green pastures. We thought of 1 Corinthians 15, Romans 8. With tears in our eyes, we stared right at cancer. But we looked to Christ, and we found ourselves filled with hope. You don't have to climb out of this world. Christ is a king, fitting and willing and bearing you up in our prosperity, but even more in affliction. So don't fear the funeral.